Please, don't let her eat alone tonight. She mistook him for her blind date, and neither of them corrected it. It was a Thursday evening on Federal Hill, and the porch lights along the sloping street were coming on one by one as the sky went dark. Inside Ferraro's, at table 9 by the window, Margot Whittaker checked her watch for the 4th time. Her date was 20 minutes late. Maybe traffic. Maybe he couldn't find parking. Maybe he had changed his mind. 2 tables away, Walter Pruitt pretended to study the dessert menu with great seriousness, glancing up over the edge of it every so often, to make sure his foster daughter hadn't been completely stood up. Then the door opened. A man stepped in, wearing a gray wool coat, exactly as Curtis had described. The dining room went quiet for half a beat, but Margot didn't notice. She stood up, relief washing over her face. "Hi, you must be Curtis." The man stopped. Something crossed his eyes that was very hard to name. "I'm sorry, but I'm not." Before he could finish, Walter quietly walked past him on his way to the counter. Without looking directly at him, the old man touched his sleeve and said softly, "Please, don't let her eat alone tonight." The man watched him go, far longer than he needed to, as though he had just recognized something. Then he looked at Margot. She was still trying to smile, but the disappointment had already reached her eyes. He hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Margot let out the breath she'd been holding. "I knew you'd come." The stranger smiled. "I'm glad someone did." What Margot didn't know was that of the 3 people in that room, she was the only one who had no idea what was really happening. If this story made you smile, or reminded you that one small act of kindness can change an entire life, please leave us a like. If you know someone who needs to hear this tonight, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe, so you can join us for a new story next week. The server brought the menus over, and Margot realized her hands were trembling slightly, so she did the thing she had always done whenever she was nervous. She talked. "I need to warn you about something first." The man looked up. "What is it?" "When I get nervous, I tell embarrassing stories about myself. I can't control it. They just come out." He folded his menu, set it down on the table, and crossed his arms. "Then I suppose I should prepare myself." Too late, and it really was too late. Less than 5 minutes later, he knew that one Tuesday morning, Margot Whittaker had stood in front of 23 third graders and called every single child by the wrong name during attendance because she had accidentally picked up the roster from the classroom next door, and not one of the children had bothered to tell her. They had simply sat there, looking at one another and smiling for 20 full minutes, until one little girl finally couldn't hold it in any longer, raised her hand, and said, "Miss Whittaker, did everyone in our class change their names today?" He laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh people gave each other on first dates, but a real laugh, one that moved through his shoulders. "What did you do?" "I told them I was testing to see who was paying attention. Then I gave the whole class an extra 10 minutes of recess to buy their silence." "Did it work?" "None of them have reported me yet. I think it was a fair deal." Then she told him about the parent-teacher conference the previous spring, when she had spent 2 straight hours standing at the classroom door shaking every parent's hand, only to discover while putting the chairs away that she had been wearing 2 different shoes, one black and one navy blue. And the worst part hadn't been the mismatched shoes. The worst part was that for those entire 2 hours, not one parent had said a word. Every one of them had noticed, and every one of them had apparently decided to leave her alone. "That's the part that broke me," she said. "An entire room full of adults, silently pitying me together, or respecting you." Margot paused. "What do you mean?" "People don't always stay quiet because they pity someone. Sometimes they stay quiet because they don't want to embarrass them." He gave a small shrug. "I could be wrong." She looked at him for another second, then reached for her water, and her sleeve caught the edge of the glass. Water spilled across the table and ran straight toward him. "Oh God, I'm sorry." She grabbed for the stack of paper napkins so quickly that she knocked her fork onto the floor, and the sharp, clear clang of metal against tile rang through the restaurant loudly enough to make people at 3 nearby tables turn and look. Margot closed her eyes. "How long have I known you now?" 9 minutes? And I've already caused a natural disaster." He didn't panic. He simply leaned forward, placed his own cloth napkin over the spreading water, then handed her a dry one. "I've seen worse." "You have?" "I once dropped an entire tray of cake at my cousin's wedding." "Dropped it how?" "Face down on the church floor." Margot covered her mouth. "What happened?" "The elderly woman who lived next door picked it up, brushed it off, and told everyone to keep eating because, according to her, the cake had only been on the floor for 3 seconds. She laughed so hard she had to put the paper napkin down. "You're lying." "I don't lie about cake." The server returned with a fresh fork and a cloth to wipe the table, and after he walked away, Margot noticed something that she wouldn't understand until much later, was far more important than it seemed. During those entire 9 minutes, the man sitting across from her hadn't touched his phone once. It lay face down on the table beside his elbow, silent, as though it didn't exist. She had been through enough evenings like this to know how rare that was. People always glanced. They glanced while waiting for their food, glanced when the conversation slowed, glanced when they thought the other person wasn't paying attention. He didn't. He sat with his back to the wall, and his face turned toward the door, and every bit of his attention rested in one place, on her. "You don't think any of this is funny?" she asked. "What?" "Me. The whole thing that is me." He thought about it for a moment, genuinely, as though the question deserved an answer he had considered. "I think it's funny," he said, "but I'm not laughing at you. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Laughing at you means standing outside and looking in." He lifted his water glass. "I'm sitting here." Margot didn't know how to answer that. 2 tables away, Walter Pruitt turned to the final page of the dessert menu, a page he had already read for the 4th time, and this time he didn't bother pretending anymore. He simply watched his daughter laughing, and he sat very still. Their food arrived. The conversation drifted from the 3rd graders to the books they loved, then to autumn in Rhode Island, then to the fact that Margot still had the habit of collecting seashells every time she went to the beach, even though she was 27 years old. And at some point, while she was halfway through a sentence, she suddenly realized something strange. She hadn't looked at the clock. Not once. Not for 5 minutes, but for the entire evening. The last time she remembered glancing at the clock on the wall, it had been 7:20, when she had still been sitting alone. Now the hands were nearing 9 o'clock, and she hadn't even noticed the time passing. When the main course was served, Margot realized she had been talking the entire evening without asking him a single question, and that embarrassed her. "What do you do?" she asked. "You first." "But I asked first. I'm slow to answer." She picked up her fork. "All right, I teach 3rd grade. St. Bridget Elementary School, right at the bottom of the hill. 3rd grade. He nodded. "How old are they?" 8, 9. "The best age." "Why the best?" Margot looked up, a little surprised, because most people asked that question simply because it was something to say. But he asked it as though he were genuinely waiting for the answer. "Because they still believe," she said. "1st graders and 2nd graders are still too little. They don't understand much yet. By 4th and 5th grade, they start learning to hold things back, to worry about being judged, to stay quiet because it feels safer. 3rd graders haven't gotten there yet. They're old enough to understand a story, but still young enough to believe in it. You read a really good book to a 3rd grader, and you can watch their whole face change. None of them pretend." She paused. "Sorry, I'm talking too much." "No," he set his knife down. "You're talking about the right thing." Then she asked again, "What about you?" And for the first time all evening, the man sitting across from her didn't answer immediately. He went quiet for a beat. Just one beat, so brief that if Margot had been looking down at her plate, she would have missed it. "I take care of a few things for my family," he said. She waited for more. Nothing came. "What kind of things?" "The kind nobody wants to hear about over dinner." He said it lightly, with a small shrug, and Margot laughed because she assumed he was being modest, or bored with his work, or simply didn't want to ruin a pleasant evening by talking about ledgers and paperwork. She had sat across from men who could talk about their jobs for 40 minutes without stopping. Compared with that, this was a welcome change. "Do you like it?" "There are parts of it I like." "Which parts?" He thought for a moment. "Being close to the people who've been here a long time. The older folks on this street. Some of them I've known since I was a kid." He slowly turned his water glass between his fingers. "They don't change. The street changes. Stores get new owners. But they still sit in the same places and tell the same stories. I like that." Margot was about to ask another question when a chair scraped behind her, and a very polite voice said, "Excuse me, may I ask you something?" Walter Pruitt was standing beside their table, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing the expression of a completely innocent man. "Do you happen to know where they keep the butter in here? My table is out." Margot stared at him. "Ask the server. I don't want to bother them." "You're bothering me." "That's different." He turned to the man sitting across from her. "Is your food all right?" "Very good, sir." "The fish?" "Yes. I was thinking about ordering the fish, too," Walter said, nodding thoughtfully. And then he remained there for another 3 seconds. 3 seconds exactly long enough to get a proper look at someone, before finally turning away. Margot covered her face with both hands. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "Him. He seems nice." "You don't understand. He's going to come back." And he did. About 7 minutes later. This time without even bothering to invent an excuse. He came carrying the dessert menu and placed it on the edge of their table as though presenting evidence. "Do you see how ridiculous this is?" he asked. "What is?" "They've arranged the desserts by price, not alphabetically." So it's wrong." Walter tapped the paper with one finger. "For 40 years I put books on shelves. 40 years. There's an order to things, and it isn't money." The server happened to pass by, stopped, and looked confused. "Sir, dessert menus don't need to be arranged alphabetically." "Everything does," Walter said, then picked up the menu and returned to his table. Leaving behind a silence Margot had no idea how to handle. The man across from her was watching the old man walk away. He wasn't laughing. He was simply watching, and there was something in his eyes that was difficult to name. The same fleeting expression that had crossed his face when he first entered the restaurant. "Was he a librarian?" he asked. "Yes. At my school. He retired a few years ago." "St. Bridget." "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he asked a question that had nothing to do with anything they had just been discussing. "Does your school still have the old library on the second floor?" Margot was pushing a piece of lemon peel toward the edge of her plate. "Oh, yes. It's still there. They only use it as a reading room now, though. All the books were moved down to the first floor. That wooden staircase creaks terribly. Every time I go up, the whole floor knows." She finished speaking and reached for her water, and she didn't ask him anything in return. She didn't ask why he knew the library was on the second floor. She didn't ask why a man who had never gone to school there knew that the building had once had an old library. Later, when Margot looked back on that evening, she would remember that she had failed to ask exactly one question. And that one question alone would have been enough for her to understand everything months earlier. But at the time, dessert had just arrived, and she was too busy laughing because he had ordered the apple pie, the very dessert that sat dead last in Walter Pruitt's ranking. The apple pie was brought out with 2 small forks, and Margot cut off a piece and pushed the plate toward the middle of the table, an old habit from the house where she had grown up, one she hadn't realized she still carried with her. "Go ahead, have some. I can't finish all of it. Delphine and I used to order 1 slice and split it every time, because back then we couldn't afford 2, and even later, when we could afford it, we still kept sharing. It just became a habit." She said it quickly, almost without thinking, and the moment the name left her mouth, she heard herself and stopped halfway through. She picked up her fork, then set it back down. "Sorry, it's nothing. Try the crust. I think they baked it a little too long." The man sitting across from her didn't touch the pie. He didn't ask who Delphine was. He didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask how long it had been. Didn't say the things people usually said at moments like this. The sentences that began with, "I'm so sorry," and ended in a silence the other person was expected to fill. He simply sat there quietly for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to tell me the rest." Margot looked up. "I only need to know one thing." He pushed the plate back toward her. "Did you eat dinner tonight?" She stared at him, confused. "We're eating right now." "I know. I'm just making sure." There was something in the way he said it that tightened Margot's throat, and she didn't know why. It wasn't a comforting sentence. It wasn't even a particularly sensible question. But for the past 2 years, so many people had sat across from her and asked whether she was all right, and she had answered yes hundreds of times, so easily that the word had stopped meaning anything. No one had ever asked whether she had eaten dinner. "I have," she said softly. "Good." He picked up his fork, cut off a piece of pie, and never brought it up again. They finished the apple pie in silence, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable at all. And Margot sat there thinking that she would remember this evening for a very long time, that someday she would tell someone about it, that perhaps Walter had been right after all when he had forced her to come. And that was exactly when her phone vibrated on the tabletop. She glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. She was going to ignore it, then thought it might be the school calling, so she reached for the phone. "Excuse me for 1 second. She pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" The man's voice on the other end came quickly. The voice of someone apologizing who wanted to get the apology over with as soon as possible. "Margot? This is Curtis. Curtis Lamb. I'm really sorry I couldn't make it tonight. Something came up at work and I've been stuck here all evening. I know this is terrible. Could we move it to next week?" Margot said nothing. She could hear the air conditioner running on the other end of the line, the sound of a door closing, and she could hear her own heartbeat beginning, strangely, to slow. "Hello? Are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'm still here. So next week? Thursday night? I'll call you back." She ended the call. She placed the phone face down on the table, exactly the way he had kept his own phone all evening. Then she looked up at the man sitting across from her, at the gray wool coat draped over the back of his chair, at his 2 hands resting very still on the table. The restaurant was just as noisy as before, Laughter from the table behind them, the clink of knives and forks, someone calling for another bottle of wine. But to Margot, all of those sounds had suddenly receded into the distance. "The man who just called me," she said, "was Curtis." He didn't look surprised. He didn't look away either. "He said he couldn't make it tonight." Margot heard her own voice coming out perfectly calm, so calm that it surprised her. "He said he's been stuck at work all evening." The man gave one slow nod. "If you're not Curtis," she said, "then who are you?" And this was the thing Margot would remember for years afterward. That he didn't panic, didn't fumble, didn't stammer while searching for an explanation. He only let out a quiet breath, like a man finally being allowed to set down something he had been carrying for too long. "I was going to tell you from the beginning," he said. "When you stood up to greet me, I had already opened my mouth." "Then why didn't you?" "Because someone asked me not to." Margot whipped around toward the table behind her. Walter Pruitt was staring down into his cup of tea with the intense concentration of a man who had just discovered something extraordinarily fascinating at the bottom of it. "My name is Enzo," he said. She turned back to him. "Enzo? Enzo Castellano." The name passed through Margot without leaving any mark at all. It was only a name. On Federal Hill, there were 100 names like it on storefront signs, on pastry boxes, on wooden plaques hanging outside shop doors. She didn't know that on this street, people didn't say that name aloud inside restaurants. All she knew was that she had just spent 2 hours having dinner with a complete stranger, and that they had been the easiest, most pleasant 2 hours she had known in 2 years. Margot rose from her chair and walked straight to the table behind her, and Walter Pruitt still wore the expression of a man deeply occupied with studying the bottom of his teacup. "Uncle Walter." "Yes, sweetheart. Look at me." He lifted his head, his eyes widening to their fullest. So innocent that if Margot hadn't known him for 12 years, she might have believed him. "You asked a complete stranger to pretend to be my date." "I never used the word pretend." "Then what did you say to him?" "I asked him not to let my girl eat dinner alone." He set his teacup down very carefully. "Those are 2 different things." Margot opened her mouth, then closed it again. People at several nearby tables had already turned to look, and she lowered her voice. "Do you even know who that man is?" "I know he was the man who walked through the door while you'd been sitting alone for 20 minutes. You don't know anything about him." "I know he stopped and let a 78-year-old man finish what he was saying." Walter shrugged. "At my age, that's a fairly complete resume. You can't just walk around outside and pick people up for me." "I didn't pick anyone up. I was walking to the counter." "What were you going to the counter for?" Walter went silent for a beat. "I forgot." And that was when Margot laughed. She hadn't wanted to laugh. She had prepared an entire speech in her head during the walk from table 9 to this one. A very solid speech with a beginning and a conclusion. But somewhere along the way it had vanished, and all that remained was laughter spilling out of her like a hiccup. She dropped into the chair across from him and covered her face with both hands. "I just spent 2 hours having dinner with a man whose name I didn't even know. Now you know it. You don't see anything wrong with this?" "I saw you laugh 3 times. Walter reached for his teacup. I counted. On the drive home, he didn't say anything else. He only looked out the car window, while Margot kept thinking about the way that man had pushed the plate of apple pie back toward her. Close to 11 o'clock that night, after she had changed clothes and was sitting on the edge of her bed preparing lesson plans for the next morning, her phone lit up. An unfamiliar number. There was only one line. "I hope Mr. Pruitt got home safely." There was no name attached to it. No question. No invitation to see him again. Nothing that required an answer. Margot stared at the message for quite a while. Then she placed the phone face down on the blanket. And when she lay down, she realized she was still smiling. And she didn't even bother wondering why. The next morning was Friday. Margot got up earlier than usual, made coffee for 2, then walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway to collect the newspaper. And among the stack of mail was an envelope that made her stop when she picked it up. It was thicker than ordinary mail. The upper left corner carried the name of a company she had never heard of. Heavy paper, the recipient's name printed in bold, and along the bottom edge was a small line of text that her eyes read automatically before she had even decided whether she should. 60 days. She stood outside in the cold for quite a while with the envelope in her hand. Then she went back into the kitchen and placed it on the table in front of Walter, beside his coffee cup. "Uncle Walter." He looked down at the envelope, and Margot, who had watched his face for 12 years, who knew exactly what that face did when he received bad news, waited for something. A blink, a furrow of his brow, a question. He didn't open it. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, lifted his coffee cup, and took a sip, set it back down, then reached for the newspaper. "Aren't you going to read it?" "No need. You don't even know what it says." "I know that kind of envelope. Walter said. Banks send letters all the time. Every month. They pay an entire floor full of people to sit around writing letters meant to frighten other people. Sweetheart, that's their job. He opened the newspaper. Don't worry about it. Uncle Walter, you're going to be late. Margot looked at the clock on the wall, and he was right. She was late, and 23 third graders would be sitting there waiting for her at 8:15. She stood there for a few more seconds. She could have picked up the envelope. She could have opened it right there in the middle of the kitchen. But the old man sitting in front of her was reading the newspaper with complete calm. His hands weren't trembling at all, and he had just turned to the sports page as though this were any other Friday morning of his life. And Margot had just had her first decent evening in many months, and she wanted to hold on to it a little longer. So she believed him. She picked up her bag, kissed the top of his head, and walked out the door. She would remember that morning for the rest of her life. Not because of the envelope, but because she left the house without looking back, and so she didn't see what happened the moment the door closed. Walter Pruitt lowered the newspaper. He sat very still in the empty kitchen. Then he reached out, pulled the envelope closer, rested the palm of his hand on top of it, and left it there for a very long time without opening it. That Friday afternoon, after all the children had gone home, Margot stayed behind in her classroom and calculated the exact cost of the previous night's dinner, added the tip, rounded the amount up, and put the money into a white envelope. She wasn't accustomed to owing anyone anything. It was something she had learned very early in life, that if you accepted something from another person and didn't give something back, that debt would sit inside your home like a piece of furniture, and you would see it every single day. So at 6 o'clock that evening, she drove up to Federal Hill and walked into Ferraro's with the envelope tucked inside her coat pocket. Only a few tables in the restaurant were occupied. Mr. Ferraro was standing behind the counter, with his glasses pushed up onto his forehead, adding figures in a ledger. He looked up at her, and before Margot could say a word, he nodded toward the window. Go sit down. Your table is ready. Margot stopped. I'm sorry. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. I'm only stopping by for a minute. Table 9, Mr. Ferraro said without lifting his eyes from the ledger. Been held since this afternoon. I didn't make a reservation. I know. He turned to another page. You didn't. Margot stood in the middle of the restaurant, her hand still inside her coat pocket, and looked toward the table beside the window. 2 place settings were laid out. 2 glasses of water had already been filled. A small folded card stood at an angle in the center of the table, the kind restaurants used to mark a table that had already been reserved. Mr. Ferraro. Yes. Who reserved the table? The old man closed the ledger, slid his glasses down onto the bridge of his nose, and looked at her with the eyes of someone who had stood behind that counter for 30 years and had seen every kind of story imaginable walk through those doors. Sit down, he said. The soup is good today. Margot sat. She placed the envelope on the table beside her water glass and stared at it, telling herself she would wait 10 minutes, no longer. She waited 4. The restaurant door opened, and the entire dining room seemed to quiet for a single beat again. And this time Margot noticed. She saw a server carrying a tray stop for half a step before continuing. She saw 2 men at a corner table look up and nod in greeting. Enzo Castellano took off his gray wool coat and draped it over the back of his chair, pulled the chair out, and sat across from her with his face turned toward the door, just as he had the first time. You're early, he said. You knew I was coming? No. He reached for his water. But if you did come, I didn't want you standing around waiting for a table. Margot pushed the envelope across the table toward him. This is yours. What is it? The money for the other night's dinner. I included the tip. He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. I'm not taking it. You have to. Why? Because I don't like owing anyone. Enzo nodded slowly, as though it were a perfectly reasonable answer he had heard somewhere before. Then you owe the wrong person, he said. The old man already paid me. He didn't pay you. He did. How? He pushed the envelope back toward her in exactly the same way he had pushed the plate of apple pie toward her the night before. With the best dinner I've had in years. Margot looked at him, and she was about to say something else when the server arrived beside their table, carrying 2 bowls of soup that neither of them had ordered, while Mr. Ferraro stood behind the counter pretending to add figures in his ledger, and Margot realized that in this restaurant, everyone seemed to know something she didn't. She slipped the envelope back into her pocket. She would find another way. But that evening, she finished the entire bowl of soup, and she went home at 9 o'clock, and she didn't look at the clock once. The following Monday afternoon was reading time for the 3rd grade, the final period of the day. The period Margot had fought the school administration for 2 years to preserve. 23 children sat cross-legged in a circle on the worn rug, and that day they were reading a book about a fox that got lost in the city. Margot made it through 3 pages before a hand shot into the air. "Miss Whitaker, can I read the part where the fox talks?" "All right." Then another hand went up. "Miss Whitaker, can I read the dog?" "I'm reading the dog. I asked first. I asked last week." Margot had to raise both hands in surrender, and in the end, they divided the parts among themselves. One child read the fox, another read the dog, and one child was assigned the sound of the car horn, and the child responsible for the car horn performed the role with such solemn dedication that the entire class collapsed onto the rug laughing, and Margot laughed with them until she had to turn away to wipe her eyes. There was one thing she never told anyone. Those Monday afternoons were what had kept her standing for the past 2 years. It wasn't the books. It was 23 voices arguing over who got to read aloud. That afternoon, Margot drove home still smiling, parked in front of the porch, opened the door, and walked into the kitchen. And there on the table was the thick white envelope, still lying exactly where she had placed it on Friday morning, unopened. Margot picked up the envelope, then set it back down, deciding she would ask Walter about it over dinner. But that evening he started telling her about an old neighbor who had owned 9 cats and named all 9 of them after presidents, and he told the story for so long that Margot forgot what she had meant to ask. That Wednesday, she went back to Ferraro's. There was no envelope this time. She told herself she had only stopped by because the soup was good, and she knew that wasn't true, and she went anyway. Enzo arrived 10 minutes after she did. They sat at table 9, and he asked her about the book with the fox, and she told him about the child who had read the part of the car horn, and he laughed so hard he had to set his glass down. Halfway through the meal, the server stopped by to refill their water and said, "Does Mr. Castellano need anything else, sir?" Margot looked up, not because of the name, because of the way the man said it. The server bent slightly as he spoke, holding the water pitcher close against his chest with both hands, and his voice was softer than the one he had used at the neighboring table less than a minute earlier. Margot watched him as he walked away. "People call you Mr. Castellano. Around here they do." "What do you mean around here?" "This street," Enzo said. "The older people are used to calling us that. They called my father the same way, and my grandfather before him. It became a habit." He said it as though it meant nothing, then asked what page the children had reached that day, and Margot answered him, and the uneasy feeling inside her faded away in less than 2 minutes. She would remember it later, many times. Thursday evening, Margot came home close to 7 o'clock and found a car parked outside the gate, the kind of car so clean it looked as though it didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. She went around through the side path because she was carrying a cardboard box filled with the children's drawing paper, and as she neared the kitchen door, she heard voices coming from the front porch, so she stopped. "I'm very sorry to bother you at this hour, Mr. Pruitt." The other man's voice was perfectly calm. It wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, contained nothing that should have frightened someone standing in the shadows along the side of the house. If all you heard was his voice, you might have thought he was an insurance agent, explaining a policy. "I only wanted to make sure you received our letter." "I did. Have you read it?" There was a silence. "Yes." "Then you know there are 53 days left." "I know. I brought you a second copy, just to be safe." There was the faint sound of papers being placed on the wooden porch table. Almost gently, almost politely, "You can keep that. I'm leaving my card as well. If you'd like to discuss any possible options, give me a call. We don't want this to reach the final stage, Mr. Pruitt." "Nobody does. Thank you." "How long have you lived here?" 41 years. "It's a beautiful house." The man sounded completely sincere. "I mean that. You don't see porches this wide anymore." Then came the sound of a chair being pushed back. "I won't trouble you any longer. Have a good evening." "You too." Margot stood motionless in the darkness beside the crepe myrtle bush, still holding the box of drawing paper, and she heard the screen door open and close, footsteps descending the 3 porch steps, a car door shutting, then the engine starting. During the entire conversation, the man had mentioned only one name, and that name was Walter Pruitt. No other name, no one else had been mentioned. The car backed out of the driveway and headed down the hill, its taillights disappearing beyond the curve. Margot set the cardboard box down on the concrete. She walked around to the front of the house, expecting Walter to have gone inside. He hadn't. He was still standing there on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, his face turned toward the slope where the car had disappeared. The porch light above him glowed yellow as it did every night, the light he never turned off, and beneath it Margot saw something she had never seen in 12 years. The old man was standing perfectly straight, not the way a healthy man stood straight, the way a man stood when he was trying not to let anyone see where he had just been struck. Uncle Walter. He didn't turn right away. It took him a moment before he finally looked back at her. "When did you get home?" Just now. She climbed the porch steps. Who was that? Oh. Walter reached for the stack of papers on the porch table, folded them in half, and slipped them into his coat pocket. Just someone from the bank. They go around checking on every house. Every month there's a new fellow. Every one of them polite. Every one of them telling me what a nice porch we have. He smiled. I suppose they're trained to say that. You told me you hadn't read the letter. I read it. On Friday. You said there was no need to. Well, I read it on Sunday. As he passed her on his way inside, he gave her shoulder a light pat. You'll get cold standing out here. Come inside and eat. I made soup. The screen door closed behind him. Margot remained on the porch for another moment. She looked down at the small wooden table where the papers had been lying. A white business card remained on its surface, one the old man had forgotten to take with him. And Margot bent down to pick it up and read the embossed name in the center beneath the porch light. Ray Teague. Margot kept the business card in her wallet for 12 days. A few times during her lunch break, she took it out, read the embossed name again, then slipped it back inside. She said nothing to Walter. By Tuesday morning, when she opened the calendar on her teacher's desk and counted backward from the day that man had stood on their porch, she came up with 41, and she realized that if she kept waiting for the old man to tell her the truth on his own, that number would reach 0 while the two of them were still eating soup together every evening and pretending nothing was wrong. So that afternoon, after all the children had gone home, she drove downtown with a folder of documents in her bag. She had stayed awake until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning preparing everything. An application for an extension, a copy of her employment contract, her 3 most recent months of pay stubs, proof that she was currently living at that address, and a handwritten letter, exactly 1 page long, that she had rewritten 7 times. She didn't know what was supposed to be included. She only knew that when you were asking someone for something, it seemed wise to bring as much paperwork as possible. The company's office was on the 4th floor of an old building near the waterfront, with gray carpeting in the hallway and evenly spaced ceiling lights. The waiting area had 4 chairs, a low table with several old magazines, and a young receptionist sitting behind a glass counter. Do you have an appointment? I don't. I only want to submit a request for an extension. Whose name is the account under? Walter Pruitt. The receptionist typed something into her computer. She kept typing a little longer than Margot expected. Then she looked up, and for one very brief moment something passed across her face. Something almost like discomfort. Would you mind waiting for a moment? Let me check on that. Of course. Margot sat in the chair beside the window. She rested the folder on her lap, held it with both hands, and sat with her back straight like a schoolchild waiting for her name to be called. Somewhere in another room, a printer was running. Someone laughed behind one of the partitions. She looked down the hallway. It stretched from the waiting area deeper into the office, with doors lining both sides, and people moved back and forth carrying files in their hands without looking in her direction. Then a man came walking from the far end of the hall. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a thick stack of files tucked against his chest. His head lowered as he read the top page while he walked. He had made it halfway down the hallway when he looked up, and he stopped dead. Not the way someone stopped, because he had suddenly remembered something he had forgotten. The way a person stopped after missing a stare in the dark. Margot looked at him. He looked at Margot. She had never met this man face to face. She had never seen a photograph of him. But she had heard that voice exactly once, over the phone, at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. And there were some voices you only had to hear once. And within less than 2 seconds, she saw everything she needed to know on his face. He knew who she was. He wasn't surprised to see an unfamiliar woman sitting in the waiting room. He was surprised to see her sitting there. Curtis, Margot said. She didn't say it loudly. She wasn't even certain the word had actually come out of her mouth. He didn't answer. He tightened his hold on the stack of files just slightly, turned around, and walked back down the hallway at an even pace, neither fast nor slow, without looking back. And somewhere near the far end, a door closed behind him. Margot sat perfectly still. Inside her mind, a collection of scattered details from the past 6 weeks began arranging themselves into place, and they fell together so quickly that she felt dizzy. That blind date hadn't been arranged by her friend. She remembered now that her friend had only said someone who knew someone wanted to ask for her number. She remembered the messages before that evening, the questions that had seemed so friendly, so natural, asking what part of town she lived in, asking who she lived with, asking whether the house belonged to her family, and she had answered every one of them, cheerfully and completely, because she had thought it was a man trying to get to know her. Then she remembered the last detail, the one she had spent 6 weeks thinking had simply been unfortunate luck. He hadn't shown up. He hadn't needed to. He had already gotten everything he needed before that dinner ever began. Miss Whitaker? The receptionist was standing behind the glass counter, calling her for the second time. Miss Whitaker? The person handling the account is ready to see you. Margot heard her. She understood every word, but her feet wouldn't lift from the floor, and both hands were still gripping the folder on her lap, the folder she had sat up until 1 o'clock in the morning revising 7 times. And she sat there thinking that for the past 6 weeks, she had been telling a complete stranger about Walter Pruitt's house, telling him eagerly, and she could still remember exactly how she had felt while typing those messages. She had been happy. She had felt as though someone cared enough to be interested in her. Margot got up from that chair without going into the office beyond the waiting room. She told the receptionist she had forgotten a document and would come back, then walked toward the elevator with the folder still held tightly against her chest, knowing she was lying, and also knowing that if she stayed in that waiting room another 10 minutes, she was going to cry in front of strangers. When she reached her car, she sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. There was only one person she wanted to ask, not because she thought he knew anything about what was happening, but because in the past 6 weeks, he was the only person who had sat across from her without asking her a single question, because he wanted something from her. She drove up to Federal Hill close to 6 o'clock. The steep street was crowded, the bakery was pulling down its shutters, and the old men were sitting outside the coffee shop just as they did every afternoon. Margot parked halfway up the hill and continued on foot, and she saw him before he saw her. Enzo was standing at the top corner of the street, at the intersection in front of the butcher shop, both hands tucked into the pockets of his gray wool coat. He was talking to a man. Margot slowed down. The other man wore an expensive coat, his hair neatly combed, and Margot recognized him immediately, not because she had ever seen his face before, but because she had heard that voice speaking to Walter on the porch, that calm, courteous voice that had complemented the width of the porch. Ray Teague. She stopped about 20 paces away, partly hidden behind a parked delivery truck. She couldn't hear what they were saying. Enzo said very little, maybe 1 sentence, perhaps 2. He didn't raise his hands, didn't raise his voice, didn't take a single step forward. He simply stood there and spoke so quietly that Ray Teague had to lean slightly toward him to hear. Then Margot saw something that sent a chill down her spine. Ray Teague nodded, then he lowered his head. It wasn't a polite nod. It was the bow of a man standing before something he wasn't permitted to argue with. A bow that lasted half a second longer than necessary. And when he raised his head again, he was smiling, the same kind of smile Margot had seen on the faces of her 3rd graders when they were called to the front of the classroom. And the whole street seemed to fall quiet for a beat, not completely silent. Cars still moved along the road, and the radio inside the butcher shop was still playing. But the 3 old men sitting outside the coffee shop all looked away at the same time. The man stacking boxes in front of the bakery stopped for a moment, then resumed what he was doing. There was a kind of silence that only happened when everyone in the same place decided together not to look in one particular direction. Margot turned around and walked back down the hill. She didn't call his name. She went home, ate dinner with Walter, nodded in the right places, laughed in the right places, washed the dishes, and wished him good night. Then she closed her bedroom door, sat down at her desk, opened her computer, and typed into the search box the name she had heard exactly twice and ignored both times. Castellano, Federal Hill. She sat reading until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Most of what she found were old newspaper articles, small print, blurred photographs, some dating back more than 20 years. There were names she had never heard before. There were words she had to read twice before she understood what they were referring to. And, in an article dated 22 years earlier, she found a photograph from a funeral, taken from a distance, a line of people dressed in black standing outside a church she passed every day on her way up to Federal Hill. She didn't finish reading that article. She closed the computer. The next morning was Wednesday. Margot took the first period off, drove up to the neighborhood a little after 8 o'clock, and found him at Ferraro's, sitting at table 9, with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, before the restaurant had even opened to customers. Mr. Ferraro saw her through the glass door and came over to unlock it. Enzo folded the newspaper when she stepped inside. "You're early." Margot didn't sit down. She stood beside the table with both arms hanging at her sides, and she heard her own voice come out perfectly calm, the frightening calm of someone who hadn't slept all night. "Who are you?" He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't ask who had told her. He set his coffee cup down and looked straight at her, and there was something in his eyes exactly like the fleeting expression that had crossed his face the first night he walked through that door. He told her his full name. Then he told her his father's name. Then he told her what he did, called it by its proper name, without circling around it, without adding a single word to make it sound softer than it was. Margot waited. She had prepared herself for an excuse. She had prepared herself for the things people always said. That I'm not like them. That I was pushed into it. That I never wanted this either. That you don't understand. None of those words came. He simply finished speaking and sat there in silence, both hands resting on the table, letting her look at him. 6 weeks, Margot said. For 6 weeks, you sat across from me at this table. I know. When were you planning to tell me? He was silent for a long time. I don't know, he said. Is that the truth? It's the only answer I have. Margot gave one small nod. She looked at the 2 glasses of water already waiting on the table, hers and his, and thought about how Mr. Ferraro had poured them before she ever arrived. Then she turned and walked toward the door. She didn't slam it behind her. That was the worst part. She closed it very softly, very carefully, the way a person closes a door when they know they won't be coming back. The next 4 days passed in a way Margot hadn't expected. She had thought she would be angry, but she wasn't. She went to work, graded papers, cooked dinner, and every evening when she sat down at the table with Walter, she realized she was listening for the sound of her phone, and that irritated her more with herself than with anyone else. No message came. She thought that was the right thing. She also thought that if he did message her, she wouldn't answer. Both thoughts were true at the same time, and together they exhausted her. On Monday morning, Walter came into the kitchen wearing the expression of a man about to announce something important. I have something to tell you. Margot was pouring coffee. All right. Last night, I fought a very dangerous garden hose. She set the coffee pot down. You tripped. I prefer my version. When did you fall? That part isn't important. Uncle Walter. I won, he said, lowering himself into his chair a little more slowly than usual. And Margot noticed that slowness, but apparently my knee lost. She came around the table, knelt beside him, and he wouldn't let her pull up his pant leg. He gently brushed her hand away, the way someone did when they didn't want another person to see something. Have you made a doctor's appointment? Already did. Margot looked up. You already made one? 9:30 this morning. You called by yourself? I know how to use a telephone, sweetheart. I taught an entire generation of children how to use an index. I'll have to take the morning off. No need. He lifted his coffee cup. I already called someone to drive me. Margot stood very slowly. Who did you call? Walter took a sip of coffee. He drank longer than necessary. Are you going to eat any toast? I made 2 slices. Who did you call? You'll find out in about 15 minutes. And exactly 14 minutes later, the sound of a car stopping outside the gate reached the house. Margot looked through the kitchen window and stood there for quite a while, still holding the dish towel in both hands, while she heard Walter in the front room struggling into his coat, coughing once, then calling toward the kitchen. Are you coming with us? She could have said no. The 78-year-old man had a sore knee, and someone was willing to drive him to the doctor. She could have said no, gone to work as usual, and no one could have blamed her for a thing. She picked up her purse. That drive was the quietest car ride of Margot's life. Walter sat in the front passenger seat. She sat in the back. Enzo drove with both hands on the steering wheel, and he didn't look into the rearview mirror even once. Not because he was avoiding her, but because he knew that if he looked, she would have to decide whether to look back, and he didn't want to make her decide anything. Only Walter spoke. He talked about the weather, about the road crew that had just repaired the stretch near the bend at the bottom of the hill, about a book he was halfway through that he complained had a main character who talked too much. He talked for 18 straight minutes. Neither of the other 2 answered with more than 3 words at a time, and the old man kept talking anyway, steadily and patiently, like someone trying to keep a fire from going out. The clinic was on the ground floor of a low building near the hospital. The doctor examined Walter for 15 minutes, took 1 X-ray, then concluded that it was a mild sprain. No fracture, no crack. Nothing more than rest and ice were needed. Walter listened, then nodded with the air of a disappointed man. So I don't get a brace? You don't need a brace. I had pictured myself with a brace. When they reached the waiting room, Walter stopped in the middle of the aisle. I'm thirsty. I'll get you some water. No. He raised one hand. The doctor just told me I'm healthy. I can walk. And he did, favoring one leg slightly as he crossed the waiting room toward the water dispenser in the corner, about 15 steps away, moving very slowly. And when he reached it, he stopped to study the 2 buttons with the concentration of a man solving a difficult problem. Margot watched him. Then she understood. She turned back. Enzo was sitting in the row of chairs beside the window, both elbows resting on his knees, and he had understood at exactly the same moment she had. Now there were only the 2 of them. In the waiting room, a mother was soothing her child in the far corner. Numbers were being called over the speaker, and the air smelled of disinfectant. Margot stood there for a few seconds, then sat down with one empty chair between them. She hadn't intended to sit. She had simply realized that standing there would look even stranger. "He set this up," she said. "The knee is real. I know the knee is real." She looked toward the water dispenser. "I mean the rest of it." Enzo didn't deny it. They sat in silence. Across the room, Walter Pruitt had finally pressed the right button and was now watching a paper cup slowly fill with water, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had just completed some great undertaking and he had no intention whatsoever of coming back anytime soon. They sat with one empty chair between them for longer than it should have taken to get a cup of water. "I'm not apologizing," Enzo said, "because I don't know what I'm supposed to apologize for sitting down that night, or for not getting up sooner." Margot stared straight ahead. "Both." "Then I'm sorry for both." She didn't answer. A while later, Walter came back with his cup of water, took 2 sips, then announced that those water dispensers made the water far too cold and someone ought to do something about it. On the drive home, he talked the entire way again, and this time, Margot answered him a few times, and she hated that she noticed herself doing it. The following week, when she counted the remaining days again on the calendar tucked inside her teacher's desk drawer, the number was 28. On Thursday afternoon, she went up to Federal Hill to ask the Land Records Office another question about the property file, and as she was walking back down the hill, it began to rain, so she slipped into the little coffee shop halfway down the street, the one with several tables pressed close to the front windows. She ordered a cup of tea and sat watching the rain. About 10 minutes later, an elderly woman pushed open the door, folded her umbrella, propped it in the corner, and walked straight to Margot's table, as though they had arranged to meet. "May I sit here?" The woman was somewhere past 80, small, slightly stooped, carrying a cloth shopping bag with several stalks of celery sticking out of the top. There were 3 empty tables in the cafe. "Of course. Please sit." The old woman lowered herself into the chair across from her, set the bag beside her feet, then removed the scarf from her head and folded it carefully into quarters, taking her time. The server brought her a cup of coffee without her having to order. "You're the teacher, aren't you?" Margot looked up. "Yes, the teacher at St. Brigid." "How did you know?" "I cooked there for 31 years, the old woman said. "People called me Signora Rinaldi. Now I only cook for myself, and I still make too much. Some habits are hard to lose." She stirred her coffee. "I retired a few years before you came to the school, but I knew your librarian." Margot smiled. "Uncle Walter, 40 years, the old woman said. "He put books in alphabetical order. I chopped onions. We argued constantly about what time the kitchen ought to close." She took a sip. "Now there's nobody left to argue with me." They talked for about 10 minutes. About the school, about the creaking wooden staircase, about how children weren't allowed to drink milk from glass bottles anymore. The old woman spoke slowly and gently, and didn't ask Margot a single personal question. Then the rain began to ease. The woman looked through the window, gave herself a small nod, then put the scarf back over her head and tied it beneath her chin. She bent down to pick up her bag, and after she had already risen, with the umbrella in one hand, she stopped beside the table and looked down at Margot. "Sweetheart." "Yes? Do you know how many years he's been eating dinner alone?" Margot looked up. The old woman didn't explain who she meant by he. She didn't say another word. She only looked at Margot for one more second, her face perfectly calm, without accusation, without pity, then turned away, pushed open the cafe door, opened her umbrella, and started down the hill beneath the lingering drizzle, the cloth bag with its stalks of celery swinging gently with every step. Margot remained in the cafe for another 40 minutes. Her tea went completely cold. That evening, she went home, ate dinner with Walter, washed the dishes, graded 18 spelling tests, and turned off the light at 11 o'clock. And she lay there until nearly 4 in the morning. She wasn't thinking about the old newspaper articles. She had been thinking about them for 4 days, and she realized they weren't what was keeping her awake. What kept her awake were the small things she had seen, without ever fitting them together. The way he always sat facing the door, the way he never touched his phone, the way he had asked whether she had eaten dinner at the exact moment she had started talking about her sister, the way he had pushed the plate of apple pie back toward her, and then pushed the envelope back toward her, twice with the same movement, the way Mr. Ferraro had poured 2 glasses of water before either of them had arrived. She lay in the darkness and asked herself a question she didn't want to ask. She asked whether, during those 6 weeks, she had ever once seen him sitting down to eat with anyone else. The answer was no, not once. Table 9 always had 2 place settings, and before the night she walked into that restaurant, she had never known who the second one was meant for. Close to 4 in the morning, Margot reached for the phone on her nightstand. She opened the message thread with the number she had never saved under a name. She typed a long sentence and deleted it. She typed another and deleted that one too. In the end, she left only 3 words, and she pressed send before she could change her mind. "Have you eaten?" He replied at 4:12 in the morning. "Not yet." She stared at the screen for quite a while. Then she typed, "Why are you still awake?" And he wrote back, "You're still awake too." Margot sat up in the darkness, leaned against the headboard, and typed the last message of that night. 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, table 9. But this time I'm paying. The next afternoon, she arrived first. She sat in her usual place, and Mr. Ferraro poured her water without saying a word, and by the time Enzo walked in, she had already finished half the glass. He hung his coat over the back of the chair and sat down. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer means I can't stay until the end of dinner." "All right. What were you doing here that night?" He didn't understand at first. "The first night," she said. "Why did you come into the restaurant? Were you meeting someone? Did you come here to eat?" "I've been thinking about it for 4 days, and I realized I never asked." Enzo was silent. He slowly turned his water glass once on the tabletop, then stopped. "I came for dinner," he said. "Alone?" "Alone. How many nights a week? Are you really asking?" "Yes." He looked toward the window. 7, he said. Margot set her water glass down. Mr. Ferraro passed by, placed a basket of bread on the table, and continued walking without looking at either of them. "Tell me," she said, and he did. He told her once, without stopping, without going back to correct himself. And Mr. Ferraro drifted toward the counter and didn't let anyone come near that table for the next 20 minutes. His father died when Enzo was 19. He didn't say what had happened. He only said that he had been 19, halfway through his second year at a university 3 hours away. And he received the call on a Tuesday afternoon while sitting in the school library, and he remembered very clearly that before leaving, he closed the book he had been reading and returned it to the exact place on the shelf, because that was the only thing he could still control at that moment. The funeral was held at the church at the bottom of the hill. He said there were a great many people there, more than he had expected. The entire street closed that day. People crowded both sides of the steps. People held his hand. People told him that he was the man of the family now, that he shouldn't worry, that they would always be there for him. He nodded to every one of them. He remembered nodding for 4 straight hours. Then evening came, and everyone went home. He said he couldn't remember how he drove back. He only remembered that by the time he opened the door to the house, it was completely dark, and he didn't turn on the lights. He walked into the kitchen and sat in the chair at the head of the table. Not his chair, but the chair where his father had always sat, and he stayed there in the darkness. "I didn't cry," he said. "I kept waiting for it to come, but it didn't. I just sat there wondering what I was supposed to do next. Not with my life." Right then, at 10 o'clock at night, sitting in a kitchen, what are you supposed to do next? He said he hadn't eaten anything all day, but he hadn't been hungry either. He remembered opening the refrigerator once, standing there staring inside, then closing it again. About half an hour later, someone knocked on the door. He hadn't intended to answer it, but whoever was knocking kept knocking, steady and patient, the kind of person who could have stood there for an hour. So eventually he went to the door. His elderly neighbor was standing on the front step, holding a pot wrapped in towels with both hands. She didn't ask whether he was all right. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't tell him everything would be fine. Didn't say his father had been a good man. Didn't say that he was at peace now. She simply walked past him into the kitchen, set the pot on the stove, turned on the light, took 2 bowls from the cabinet, filled one of them, and placed it in front of the chair where he had just been sitting. Then she said exactly one thing. "Sit down. The food is getting cold." I sat down, Enzo said. I finished that whole bowl of soup. Then she filled another one, and I finished that one too. He paused. That was the first real meal I had eaten since the day I got the call. Margot said nothing. She sat very still, both hands resting in her lap. She sat across from me until I was finished. She didn't say another word. Then she washed the pot, left the rest of the soup in the refrigerator, turned off the kitchen light, and went home. He looked down at the table. Everyone who stood outside that church that day said beautiful things to me. I can't remember a single one of them. The only thing I remember is the sentence about the food getting cold. He looked up. From that day on, I made myself one promise. If I ever saw someone having to eat alone, I would sit down. I wouldn't ask anything. I wouldn't say anything. I would just sit down. He said the last sentence very softly. Because once, someone sat down with me. Margot remained silent for a long time. Then she reached across the table and pushed the bread basket toward him. That Saturday was the school's fall fair, held in the back courtyard, and Margot had been assigned to judge the pumpkin contest, a duty she had taken on for the past 3 years, and had never once completed without someone filing a complaint. 19 pumpkins were arranged across 2 long rows of tables. Some had smiling faces painted on them, some had yarn glued on for mustaches, and one was wearing an actual knitted hat. The children crowded around them, jostling one another and shouting the names of their pumpkins every time Margot came near with her score sheet. And when she announced first place, the entire courtyard erupted, half the children cheering, and the other half groaning in outrage, while the winner lifted the pumpkin over their head and marched triumphantly around the table like a champion. Margot laughed so hard she had to put the score sheet down. Then she looked up and saw him. Enzo was standing on the other side of the chain-link fence, outside the school grounds, about 20 paces away. He didn't come in. She waved. He raised one hand in return, a very small wave at shoulder height. She gestured toward the gate, the kind of gesture that meant, "Come on in. The gate is open." He shook his head, not the shake of someone who was busy. It was the firm shake of a man who had drawn a line for himself and had no intention of stepping across it. He stayed outside the fence for another 10 minutes or so, long enough to hear the full roar when second place was announced, then nodded to her once more and walked down the hill. That afternoon, Margot came home early and found a folding ladder propped against the porch, and the porch light was on. That bulb had been burned out for 3 weeks. She knew exactly that it had been 3 weeks, because she remembered the first night she had to fumble with the lock in the dark, and twice she had told Walter to let her go buy a new bulb, and both times he had said he would do it tomorrow. He hadn't. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps looking at the ladder, and she understood something she had refused to let herself think about for those 3 weeks. The old man hadn't forgotten. He couldn't climb up there anymore, and he would never say it aloud. Not to her, not to anyone, because for a 78-year-old man who had replaced the light bulbs in his own house for 41 years, there were some things a person would rather sit in darkness than admit. In the kitchen, Walter was arranging apples in a bowl. Who put the ladder outside? What ladder? Uncle Walter. Oh, that ladder. He turned one apple so the stem pointed upward. He stopped by to return a book. You lent him a book? Last week, and he just happened to replace the light bulb? I didn't ask him. Walter set the bowl of apples in the middle of the table. He went outside, looked up at the light, then asked where I kept the ladder. I told him it was in the shed. That was all. He shrugged. You can't argue with a man who already has the ladder in his hands. That evening, after Walter had gone to bed, Margot stayed at the kitchen table to look up the address of the notary office she needed to visit Monday morning. The old man kept everything important inside a long wooden box he had brought home from the school on the day he retired. An old library card catalog box with 2 sliding drawers and a metal rod running through the cards to hold them in place. He stored everything important inside it, arranged in alphabetical order, and he still insisted it was the finest filing system humankind had ever invented. Margot pulled open the second drawer and flipped to the letter C. She found the card with the notary office's name, copied down the address, and when she pushed the cards back into place, something behind them caught. She pulled the drawer all the way out. At the very back, folded into quarters and tucked vertically along the wooden side, was a stack of papers. She took it out and unfolded it beneath the kitchen light. It was a copy of a loan agreement. The first page had Walter Pruitt's name on it, the address of this house, and the company name printed in the upper corner, the same name she had seen on the business card left behind on the porch. The date on the agreement was 2 years earlier. Margot sat down. She read the first page twice. Then she turned to page 2. The second page was crowded with small print, numbered clauses packed closely together, and at the bottom was a line, and on that line was a signature. She stared at it. Margot had been looking at Walter Pruitt's handwriting for 12 years. She had seen it on notes stuck to the refrigerator, on envelopes, on the backs of photographs, on thousands of catalog cards inside this very wooden box, all of it written in small, neat capital letters that leaned slightly to the left, the habit of a man who had spent his whole life writing so other people could read what he wrote. She flipped back to the first page and compared the 2 signatures. The first page was his handwriting. The second was not. It was close. Close enough that if she had only glanced at it, she wouldn't have noticed. But the P on the second page had been written in one continuous stroke, and Walter Pruitt always lifted his pen. He always had. He had once stood in front of a classroom and told the children that the letter P was the only letter that forced a person to do 2 separate things, and he had repeated that line so many times that Margot could hear his voice now, in the silent kitchen, close to midnight, with the papers trembling in her hands. Margot sat in the kitchen until dawn. She didn't go upstairs. She left the papers spread open on the table, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat there waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Walter came down a little after 6 o'clock, favoring one leg slightly, as he had for the past few weeks. He saw her, then he saw the papers. He stopped on the final step, one hand still resting on the banister, and Margot watched the whole thing pass across his face in less than 2 seconds. He didn't ask where she had found them. He didn't ask why she had gone through the box. He simply walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. "Let me pour you some coffee," he said. "Uncle Walter, let me pour it." He poured 2 cups. His hands didn't shake. That was what Margot would always remember, that the old man's hands didn't shake at all. "Tell me." Walter set the coffee pot down. He looked at the papers on the table for a long time. Then he began to speak. And he spoke in the same steady voice he always used when reading to children, the voice of a man accustomed to telling stories for other people to hear, except this time there was nowhere in the story to stop and catch his breath. He said that 2 years earlier, when it became clear that Delphine was going to need care in a better place than the one where she was staying, and when the bills started arriving in the mailbox once a week, he had sat at this very table and worked through the numbers for 3 nights in a row. He said he had gone to the bank first. The bank turned him down because he was 76 years old, and his income was the pension of a public school librarian. He said that after that, he went somewhere else, a company with an office on the 4th floor near the waterfront, a place that accepted applications from people the banks had already rejected, and they were very polite to him, and they approved the loan in only 4 days. "Did you read all of it?" Margot asked. "I read the first page very carefully." "What about the second page?" Walter was silent. "Did you sign the second page?" "I don't remember seeing a second page." He said it very slowly. "I sat there for almost 2 hours. They handed me the papers one at a time, pointed to the blank spaces, and I signed. I was 76 years old, and that girl was lying in room 409, and all I wanted was to finish quickly enough to visit her that afternoon." He pushed his coffee cup aside. "I don't remember the second page. That's the most honest answer I have." Margot looked down at her hands. "Delphine died the following March," she said. "Yes. And you didn't tell me anything." "No. For 2 years. For 2 years. You let me think it was my debt." That was where the old man's voice changed. "Yes," he said. "I let you think that." Margot stood up from the table. She walked to the sink and stood with her back to him, both hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Why?" Walter didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, he spoke to her back. "Do you remember when you were 15? Don't. I'll only say one thing, and then I'll stop." He waited. She didn't turn around, but she didn't tell him to stop either. "That girl came to my library every afternoon for 3 months, Walter said. "Then I filled out the paperwork." He let the sentence remain between them. "From that day until now, there hasn't been a single time when I had to tell you I couldn't take care of things. Not once. I held on to that for 12 years. He paused. "Then 2 years ago, I lost it, and I didn't know how to say that out loud." Margot still had her back to him. "You'd rather let me carry it?" "I didn't think you would have to carry it," he said. "I thought I would find a way to fix it in time. I believed that for the first 20 months. By the 21st month, I knew I couldn't, and by then it was too late to figure out how to begin telling you." A car passed outside. Somewhere on the porch roof, a bird made a sound. "There's one more thing," Walter said. "You asked me why. I just gave you the easy part." Margot turned around. The old man was sitting very straight in his chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, and he was looking out the kitchen window instead of at her. "My wife has been gone 11 years, he said. "For those 11 years, I've eaten dinner alone. I've never complained about that to anyone, because it isn't something to complain about. But I know how it starts." He gave a small nod, as though confirming it to himself. "It doesn't start with sadness. It starts when you stop cooking, then you stop setting the table, then you eat standing beside the stove. And one day you realize you haven't sat down at the dinner table in an entire month, and somehow that doesn't even seem strange anymore." He turned and looked at her. "I've been watching you for 2 years. You come home from work, you grade papers, you eat standing beside the stove. Did you think I didn't notice?" Margot couldn't say anything. "I didn't want to watch you begin," Walter said, "especially when it was my fault." Then the old man lifted one hand and held it there for a moment, covering his eyes, and Margot crossed the kitchen and sank down beside his chair, and she rested her head against his arm, exactly the way she used to when she was 15 years old in the library on the 2nd floor. 5 days later, when there were only 6 unchecked squares left on the calendar tucked inside her teacher's desk drawer, Margot received a phone call in the middle of her lunch break. A woman's voice spoke very quickly. the voice of someone reciting words she had said many times before. The case under the name Walter Pruitt had been placed under a temporary stay of enforcement, pending further review. No additional action was required from the family at this time. "Thank you, and have a good day." Margot stood in the middle of the school hallway, with the phone pressed to her ear. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who requested the stay?" There was a second of silence on the other end. "A complaint was filed, ma'am." "By whom?" "I'm not permitted to discuss the details of the case over the phone." She drove up to Federal Hill immediately after her last class. She walked straight into Ferraro's without looking at anyone, and he was sitting at table 9. And she planted both hands on the tabletop before she even managed to sit down. "What did you do?" Enzo looked up. "Sit down first. You paid it off, didn't you?" "No, don't lie to me. I've never lied to you except about one thing. And you already know what that was." Margot sat down. She was trembling, and she hated that she was trembling. "Listen to me," she said. "Uncle Walter is everything I have left. That house is the only place I have, and I've taken care of everything myself for 2 years, alone, without asking anyone for a single dollar, even during the months when I had to teach extra classes 6 nights a week." Her voice broke. "So if you just spent your money buying that house back for me, then whatever this is between you and me ends here. I don't want to be bought. I'd rather lose the house." Enzo sat quietly and listened until she had finished. Then he bent down, opened the leather briefcase beside his chair, and took out a file. He placed it in the middle of the table and pushed it toward her. "I didn't pay a single dollar," he said. "Open it." Margot opened the file. The first page was a copy of page 2 of the loan agreement, the very page she had found in the drawer of the wooden box. The second page was a comparison report, with the 2 signatures enlarged and placed side by side, thin lines pointing to the differences between them, and at the bottom was the conclusion of a forensic document examiner, complete with a name, professional license number, and original signature. She read every line. The letter P had been written in one continuous stroke. "How did you get this?" "I sent handwriting samples for examination. The old man lent me books. He writes his name on the inside cover of every book in the house." She turned to the final page. It was a copy of the complaint that had been filed with the regulatory agency. An official received stamp in the upper corner, and Margot read down to the very end of the complaint, to the section identifying the person who had filed it. There was a name there. She stared at it for a long time. "You put your name on it?" "Yes." "You could have had a lawyer file it?" "Yes." "You could have filed it through Uncle Walter. It's his case." "Yes." "Then why?" Enzo didn't answer immediately. He turned his water glass once and stopped, the same movement she had seen him make only once before, on the night he told her about the pot of soup. "Because they're going to look up whoever filed the complaint," he said. "If it's a lawyer, they negotiate. If it's a 78-year-old man, they stall. The old man doesn't have time to be stalled." He looked directly at her. "If it's me, they stop immediately." Margot understood more slowly than she wanted to admit. "This complaint is a public record," she said. "Yes. Anyone can look it up." "Yes. Including people on your side." He didn't answer, and in that silence, Margot understood the full cost of the paper she was holding. For 22 years, the man sitting across from her had never put his name on any record. No applications, no contracts, not a single signature anywhere an outsider could search for. That wasn't caution. That was how he existed. He was the man an entire street bowed its head to, yet no one ever wrote his name down. And he had just written that name with his own hand, on a complaint filed with a government agency, in exchange for 6 days for an old man he had only shared a few meals with. "You did this because of me," she said. "No," he shook his head. "Don't think of it that way. It'll turn into a debt, and you can't stand owing anyone." "Then why did you do it?" "Because they put a paper in front of a 76-year-old man and had him sign something he wasn't allowed to read," Enzo said. "I can't let that go, no matter who happens to be sitting in that chair." The next day, Ray Teague called his own office number 3 times trying to find out who had filed the complaint, and when he finally saw the name on the received copy, he sat alone in his office for nearly 40 minutes without calling anyone. He wasn't the only person who saw that name that week. In a coffee shop near the top of the hill, 2 old men sat together for a very long time, and neither of them ordered another cup of coffee. That evening, Margot went home and pulled open the second drawer of the wooden box to file the copy of the complaint under the letter G. And as she flipped through the cards toward the place where it belonged, her hand brushed against one card lying sideways, belonging to no alphabetical section at all, as though someone had slipped it between the others simply to keep from losing it. She pulled it out. It was an old library catalog card, with the original ruled lines still printed across the front. In the upper right corner was a date, and Margot had to look at it twice before she believed what she was seeing. It was the Thursday she had sat waiting at table 9. On the back of the card was a single line written in ink, in small, neat capital letters that leaned slightly to the left. A good man isn't a man without a past. He's a man who chooses not to walk away when he could. Margot read the sentence beneath the kitchen light, then read it a second time, then sat down with the catalog card in her hand. The old man had written it on the very day he walked past table 9, not afterward, not when everything had become clear. That very day, when he came home, he had taken a catalog card from the box and written down what he believed, then tucked it into a place where, according to his own system, it didn't belong anywhere at all. She sat in the kitchen for a very long time. Then she understood that she had been avoiding something for 9 weeks, and that she had avoided it in every way she knew how, with anger, with old newspaper articles, with the excuse that she needed time, and none of those reasons held up anymore. Early Saturday morning, she got up, put on her favorite blue coat, and drove to Federal Hill. She already knew what she was going to say. She practiced it in the car all the way up the hill. Ferraro's was closed. Not closed in the ordinary way a restaurant was closed because it was too early to open. The glass door was locked, the curtains inside were drawn, every light was off, and a handwritten cardboard sign hung on the door with only a few words and no explanation. Margot stood looking at that sign for a long time. She had been eating there for nearly 9 weeks. She had heard Mr. Ferraro tell her that he had opened the restaurant when he was 31 and had closed it only twice since then. Once on Christmas Day, and once on the day his wife gave birth to their second child. 30 years. Not one ordinary weekday. She took out her phone and called. It didn't ring. It went straight to an automated voice saying that the subscriber was currently unavailable. She called again. The same thing happened. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up the hill. There was something strange about Federal Hill that morning, and it took Margot a while to understand what it was. The street was still busy. The bakery was open. The butcher shop was open. The old men were still sitting outside the coffee shop farther up the hill, but no one was speaking loudly. There was no laughter. People still greeted one another, still bought and sold things, and every one of them was doing it at a lower volume than usual, the kind of volume an entire neighborhood slipped into without being told when something was happening, and nobody wanted to be the first person to say it aloud. Margot walked up the hill. She stopped at only one place. Signora Rinaldi's house stood halfway up, a narrow cream-colored house with several pots of basil on the front steps. Margot knocked. It was a long time before she heard footsteps. The door opened halfway. The old woman stood there with the same scarf tied beneath her chin, a kitchen towel still in one hand. She looked at Margot. She didn't ask what she wanted. She didn't invite her inside. She only looked at her, and there was no irritation in her eyes at all, only something that looked almost like sorrow. Then she shook her head. Once, please, Margot said. I only want to know if he's all right. Signora Rinaldi shook her head again. Then she closed the door slowly, without slamming it, and Margot heard the lock slide into place from the other side. She walked back down the hill and returned to the locked restaurant door. She stood there until nearly noon. She didn't know what she was waiting for. She thought perhaps the curtain would move. She thought perhaps Mr. Ferraro would come out and unlock the door and tell her he had only gone to pick up supplies. She thought of 100 possibilities, and she realized that none of them explained why Enzo's phone was turned off. A man like him didn't turn off his phone. And standing there in front of a glass door, with the curtains drawn, in the middle of a street where everyone was deliberately speaking softly, Margot Whittaker understood something about herself. For the past 2 years, she had believed the greatest fear of her life was having to sit down at a dinner table alone. She had feared it enough to agree to a blind date with a man she had never met. She had feared it enough to eat standing beside the stove for 2 years so she wouldn't have to look at the empty chair across the table. Now she knew that wasn't it. Eating alone was sad, but at least you knew where everyone was. This was the real fear. Standing in front of a locked door on a Saturday morning and not knowing where the person you needed most in the world was, whether he was alive or dead, whether he was safe or hurt, and having no one on the entire street willing to tell you. She walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel and rested both hands on it, staring through the windshield for a very long time before starting the engine. By early evening, when she arrived home, Walter was sitting on the porch beneath the yellow light. One look at her face was enough. You went looking for him? Margot nodded. It's been 2 days, he said quietly, and Margot's head snapped up, because she had only been looking for him since that morning, while the old man had already known for 2 days. You knew, and you didn't tell me? Walter pointed to the chair beside him. Sit down, Uncle Walter. I'll tell you what I know, and this is all I know. He waited until she sat. Ferraro called me Thursday night. He said he had to close the restaurant for a few days and told me not to worry. I asked him why. He wouldn't say. I've known that man for 40 years, and he has never once refused to tell me something. Margot covered her face with both hands. So you don't know where he is either? I don't. The old man sat quietly for a moment, looking down the hill beneath the porch light. But I do know you've been looking in the wrong places. She looked up. Where did you go this morning? I went to the restaurant. Then I went up to Signora Rinaldi's house. And after that, I went back and stood outside the restaurant. Walter nodded. You went looking for him in the places where he works, he said. The places where people know who he is. But this didn't begin in any of those places. He turned to look at her. This began at a table. Margot sat very still for a long time. The restaurant is closed, Uncle Walter. Yes, today it is. He reached over and gave her knee a gentle pat. Come inside and eat. Tomorrow is Sunday. That Sunday felt so long to Margot that it seemed to contain more hours than other days. She finished grating the rest of the papers. She cleaned the entire kitchen. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she sat at the dining table with a book and couldn't read a single word. And at 6:30, she stood up, took her car keys, and Walter didn't ask where she was going. She drove up to Federal Hill for the third time in 2 days. She could see it from the bottom of the hill. Warm yellow light spilled through the glass onto the sidewalk. The same kind of light that had been there on that first Thursday night. Ferraro's was open again. Margot parked where she wasn't supposed to and didn't care. She walked inside, and the clock on the wall read 7:12, and the restaurant was crowded like any other Sunday evening, filled with the sound of silverware and the smell of fresh bread. Mr. Ferraro stood behind the counter. He saw her. He didn't say anything loudly. He only tilted his head toward the window, and as she passed the counter, he said softly, just loud enough for her alone to hear, "He's been sitting there for 2 nights. Margot stopped. 2 nights? Friday, Saturday. The old man wiped his hands on his apron. He didn't order anything, just sat. She turned toward the window. Table 9. He was sitting with his face toward the door as always, his gray wool coat draped over the back of his chair, and on the table were 2 glasses of water already filled, one in front of him and one across from him, waiting before an empty seat. He looked up. They looked at each other across the entire room, and neither of them moved first. Then Margot walked to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She reached for the second menu beside the other place setting and pushed it across the table toward him, and she said, "Don't let him eat dinner alone." Enzo lowered his head. He laughed very softly, and when he looked up again, his eyes were red. "That sounds familiar," he said. "I learned it from someone who's very good at persuading people. I know him." The server brought over a basket of bread that neither of them had ordered, then quietly disappeared. "Where did you go?" Margot asked. "Boston. 2 days. 2 days. Why did you turn off your phone?" He didn't answer immediately. "I didn't turn it off," he said. "I left it behind." "Where?" "In my desk drawer, with everything else." Margot rested one hand on the edge of the table. "Tell me." And he did, slowly, without avoiding a single word. He said that after the complaint was filed, it had taken him 3 days to understand something. That from the moment his name appeared on a piece of paper anyone could search, everything he had kept separate and private for 22 years could no longer remain that way. Not only his own name, but the names standing close to it. "Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," Margot said. "People would trace backward. They already did." He said he went to Boston to see his uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who still held authority within the family. He said he sat in one room for almost 2 days and handed everything back, one thing at a time, keeping nothing for himself. He said his uncle asked what he wanted in return. "He thought I would ask for money," Enzo said. "People always ask for money." "What did you ask for?" Enzo looked directly at her. "One thing. From now on, no one in that family is ever to know that you exist." Margot sat motionless. "Not your name. Not where you work. Not the address of that house. It isn't that they'll leave you alone." He shook his head. "They'll never know there is a you in this world." She could hear her own heartbeat. "And the phone? That world finds people through phones," he said. "It doesn't find people through a table in a restaurant." Margot opened her purse. She took out a paper napkin, folded into quarters, softened and creased from being carried in her bag for 9 weeks. The same napkin he had handed her the night she spilled her water and knocked the fork onto the floor. She placed it on the table and pushed it toward him. He unfolded it. On the back, written in ballpoint pen, were 2 lines. "Table for 2. No reservation needed from now on." Enzo read it twice. Then he folded the napkin again, very slowly, carefully following the old creases, as though it had just become something valuable, and slipped it into his wallet. The following Sunday, Walter Pruitt announced that he was going to cook dinner, that no one was allowed to ask what he was making, and that if anyone arrived early, that person would have to wash the vegetables. Signora Rinaldi arrived early. She came carrying a cloth basket, looked at the pot on the stove for exactly 3 seconds, then pushed the old man aside and took the ladle from his hand. And Walter said this was precisely why, for 40 years, he had never invited her to his house. The dining table stood in the middle of the kitchen with 4 places set. Enzo arrived close to 7 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and a book he was returning to Walter. And the old man took the book, opened the inside cover to make sure his name was still there, then nodded with satisfaction. They ate for a very long time. There were arguments about how much salt belonged in the food. Stories from Signora Rinaldi about children long ago who used to hide their vegetables in their pockets, and complaints from Walter that nobody knew how to arrange anything alphabetically anymore. When it was time to clear the dishes, Margot was standing at the sink when she heard Enzo say to the old man, very casually, as though it were something everyone already knew, "I knew I wasn't Curtis from the very second you walked past the table." Margot turned around. "What did you just say?" The entire kitchen went quiet. Walter was holding the coffee pot, and he set it down. "Oh," he said, "I thought you already knew." "Knew what?" And that was when Signora Rinaldi burst out laughing. She laughed so hard she had to put the dish towel down on the table. The laugh of an 84-year-old woman who had been keeping something to herself longer than she could bear. "Sweetheart," she said, "more than 30 years ago, in the library on the 2nd floor of St. Brigid, there was a boy who borrowed more books than any other child in the entire school that year." Margot stood motionless at the sink with a plate still in her hand. "He borrowed 3 books a week," Walter said, "then 4. By October, I had to tell him he was only allowed to borrow 2 at a time. Not because I was stingy with the books, but because I was afraid he wouldn't have enough time to finish them, and he would be disappointed." The old man sat down. He finished every one. Every time. He sat at the table beside the window. Signora Rinaldi said. The kitchen closed at 4 o'clock. And every afternoon when I walked through the library on my way home, I saw him sitting there. His father worked down on the street and couldn't come up to get him until 5. So I saved him a piece of cake every day, wrapped it in wax paper and left it on the checkout desk. She shrugged. That boy always folded the wax paper into a neat little square after he ate before throwing it away. You remember a child who does something like that. My father was never later than 5:15, Enzo said. Margot put the plate down. She turned to Walter. You recognized him. I recognized the face, the old man said. After all these years, I didn't remember the name. I only remembered that he was the boy who borrowed the most books. He picked up the coffee pot. That's why I dared to ask him that night. Did you think I was just wandering around the street picking up strangers for you? I told you I wasn't. Did you know who he was? Walter stopped. What do you mean, who he was? That name, Margot said. On that street. The old man looked at her, and his face was completely blank. And Margot understood in exactly 1 second. I worked at a school for 40 years, sweetheart, Walter said. I organized books. I didn't organize people. He poured the coffee. I only asked a boy who loved to read for a favor. Margot stood in the middle of the kitchen. Signora Rinaldi was still chuckling softly. Enzo was looking down at the table, and Margot looked from one of them to the other before asking, So everyone in this house knew. I'm the only one who didn't. You just found out later, Walter said. Some people need a little more time. Margot covered her mouth and laughed, then stopped, then laughed again, and she sat down in the chair. And on the refrigerator door behind her was a card as large as 2 hands, made from construction paper and covered with colorful cut-out autumn leaves, with a carefully written message in crayon that said, We hope Miss Whitaker is always happy. And underneath it were 23 names, written in 23 different kinds of handwriting, several of them with one letter written completely backward. She had hung it there Friday afternoon. After everyone had gone home, Margot wiped down the table while Walter stood pouring himself more coffee. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. Then she said, Dad. The old man stopped. He didn't turn around right away. In 12 years, she had never called him that once, and both of them knew it. He only gave the smallest nod, then turned away and finished pouring the coffee, cleared his throat once, and said the pot had brewed this batch too strong. Outside on the porch, the yellow light was still glowing as it did every night. And down the street, inside Ferraro's, on the following Thursday evening, at table 9, beside the window, there was a young woman looking at the clock for the 4th time, and outside the glass door there was a man standing there hesitating, while Mr. Ferraro quietly placed 2 glasses of water on the table. People often think love begins at the moment we meet the right person, but perhaps it begins much earlier than that. It begins on the day a cafeteria cook saves a piece of cake for a child sitting alone with a book. It begins on the day a librarian decides to sign the paperwork for a 15-year-old girl who keeps coming to the library. Enzo could have corrected the misunderstanding and walked out the door. Walter could have continued straight to the counter without stopping. Margot could have eaten dinner alone for one more night, and no one in the world would ever have known. The kindness we give today doesn't always return to us right away. Sometimes it takes decades to find its way back. And when it does, it may be wearing a face we never could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that every day we can have another warm story to sit together and listen to. How did tonight's story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who sat down beside you at exactly the moment you needed them most? Please leave a comment. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next story.